tout le monde. Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you today as the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship launches its 10th annual speaker series. C'est un grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue alors que le Centre pour l'étude de la citoyenneté démocratique lance aujourd'hui sa 10e série de conférenciers annuels. J'ai une pensée spéciale aujourd'hui pour Dietlen Stolle, notre collègue et la directrice précédente du CECD. Je me rappelle une retraite annuelle du CECD en 2011 à l'auberge La Sapinière à Val-David, où Dietlen avait eu l'idée d'une série de conférences où des invités de partout dans le monde viendraient nous présenter des recherches sur des sujets, des questions pertinentes eu égard aux axes de recherche du CECD. Et la directrice du CECD de l'époque, Elisabeth Giddingill, avait trouvé l'idée très intéressante et mandaté Dietlen d'organiser cette série de conférenciers annuels qui est devenue un élément majeur de notre programmation. Donc, je tiens à souligner la contribution de Dietlen. Our series will continue on Friday, December 3, with a presentation by Kat Smets, a senior lecturer in politics at Royal Holloway University of London. She is also the co-editor-in-chief of electoral studies. It is also a great honor to introduce you the speaker who opens this 10th annual series, Cristian Vaccari. Cristian is a professor of political communication at the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Loughborough University, where he is also the co-director of the Centre for Research in Communication and Culture, an interdisciplinary center combining social science and humanities approaches for the exploration of the production and consumption of different forms of communication and creative texts. Before joining Loughborough in 2018, he taught at Royal Holloway University of London, him too, and the University of Bologna. Many of you already know Cristian Vaccari for different reasons. Premièrement, il a visité le Québec à quelques occasions. En 2014, il a participé à un atelier sur les partis politiques à l'ère numérique, organisé par mon collègue Thierry Giasson et Fabienne Greffet dans le cadre du congrès de l'Association internationale de sciences politiques à Montréal. En 2016, aussi à l'invitation de Thierry, il passa 2 jours en compagnie des membres du groupe de recherche en communication politique, le GRCP, dans le cadre de l'atelier international du GRCP qui a lieu chaque année en avril. J'en profite d'ailleurs pour saluer mon collègue Thierry qui est parmi nous aujourd'hui. Secondly, you may also know Cristian Vaccari because you were asked to review a manuscript for the International Journal of Press Politics. Indeed, he is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics, arguably one of the most prestigious in the field of political communication. Its Journal of Citation Report Impact Factor ranks International Journal of Press Politics among the top 10 journals, both in political science and in communication. And thirdly, I'm sure that many of you know him through his many publications. Cristian Vaccari studies political communication in a comparative perspective with a particular focus on digital media. In 2013, he published a first book entitled Digital Politics in Western Democracies, a comparative study. Since that time, Cristian has continued to investigate this evolving subject through several conference papers and journal articles. From his personal website, I learned that Cristian Vaccari, with some co-authors, has received awards by the American Political Science Association 3 times in 4 years for the best article published in the field of political communication in 2016, the best article published in the field of information technology and politics in 2017, and for a conference paper in 2019. Many of his research contributions have been co-authored with Augusto Valeriani, an associate professor in sociology of culture and communication at the University of Bologna. Together, Augusto Valeriani and Cristian Vaccari just published Outside the Bubble, Social Media and Political Participation in Western Democracies at Oxford University Press. Outside the Bubble, I believe that the title is a cue about one of the major arguments of that book. So today we'll present us some findings. Cristian Vaccari, thank you very much for being with us. So I invite you to open your mic and to start your presentation.
Thank you, Frederic. This was a really fantastic introduction that I really appreciate. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's a great honor. So thank you all for coming. So I will start by acknowledging the contribution of those who have made this book possible. First of all, my co-author and friend Augusto from the University of Bologna, who started working with me on this project in 2013. The project was funded by the Italian Ministry of Education and Research and enabled us to work together in what became, arguably a very long and productive journey. And I was very happy that you mentioned my participation in the GRCP event in 2016. And that's why I had added this to my acknowledgement slide, without consulting with you, Frederic, I hasten to add. Because really, that was a very special moment for me. I was invited to this very high-profile event with a lot of amazing speakers, and we were beginning to put our heads together in terms of what this project could mean. We had written some papers, we'd done a few interesting things, but it was at the time mainly a combination of papers with some findings rather than an argument. And events like this one, where we could spend a lot of time with smart people, some of whom are here today, and that makes me very happy, giving us feedback and giving us ideas, that was really one of the instrumental points in turning this from a collection of journal articles into an argument and a book. And I particularly remember a comment from you, Frederic, about the conceptualization of political participation, which ended up being very influential in how we conceptualize political participation and the independent variables that predict it in the book. So without further ado, we start from the literature, we start from the premises of some of the literature. And in the book, we argue that research in social media and political participation, which of course is gigantic and continues to develop, at least at the time we conceptualized the book and wrote the book, was marred by three limits that we don't consider as universal. We don't want to create straw men. We don't like arguing that way, but we do think that some, at least of the most important studies in the field, suffer from these limits. And we try to propose some solutions that hopefully the book provides. The first one is that affordances of social media were interpreted as destiny. So because you can select who you're going to talk to on social media, that means you're going to end up in an echo chamber or in a filter bubble, as the title evokes. And we believe that this is a simplistic notion of the relationship between technology and society. As we know from in-depth investigation in what happens with Facebook, Facebook cannot really control what its affordances actually do to democracy. And when it tries to change things, it doesn't always achieve its goal. So to think that affordances are a destiny to us is a mistake. We think affordances and the implications of affordances on participation should be treated as an empirical question. And we think that instead of just focusing on social media use, we should focus on very specific political experiences on social media that people might have and how these might have a relationship with participation. The second fallacy we identify is what we call the one effect fits all fallacy. Most studies of social media and politics have just focused on the general population, have theorized their effects on the population as a whole. They have not differentiated very much between different groups. and different subgroups. And we believe that it's about time that we start looking at differential effects among different individuals. People are different. They have very different ways of approaching politics, both online and offline, different ways of thinking about politics. And so we want to test at least two sets of differential effects regarding different levels of political involvement and ideology and populist voting behavior. And I'll say something more about this shortly. Finally, what we call the contextual vacuum fallacy, the idea that social media and politics work pretty much in the same way across Western democracies, which mainly means, taking results from research conducted in the US and to some degree in other English-speaking countries and universalizing these to, other Western democracies. And again, as a comparativist, it's no surprise that I'm not particularly happy with that approach. And because most research on social media and politics is still based on single country case studies, perfectly executed, but still single country. And so we have a comparative research design which enables us to at least begin to assess some differential effects at the system level in the relationship between political experiences on social media and participation. So what are these political experiences on social media and how do they stack up compared to other important outcomes that happen through or on social media? So for us, political experiences is the ways in which citizens encounter politics on online social media. Of course, there are many ways in which these encounters can take place. They might have different contents. They might take place in different contexts, and I'll explain in a moment. But essentially, political experiences are things that you encounter on social media that have political relevance. Then there is a second layer, which we call political citizenship, and that entails more purposeful activities having to do with politics, but that are not aimed at generating a specific political outcome. And this basically taps into things like actively searching for news and discussing politics, but without a specific aim to affect other people. There's a huge debate in the literature about, discursive participation and whether talking about politics is a form of participation. Some people say yes, some people say no. Our position is that it's a form of participation. It has the quality highlighted in the third item in this slide, which is aiming at achieving specific political outcomes. So if I talk to you about politics without aiming to convince you about something, I'm not pursuing a political outcome. I'm engaging in an act of political citizenship. But if I'm talking to you about politics and I try to persuade you about something, then I'm trying to achieve a political outcome and I'm engaging in a form of political participation. More broadly, forms of participation are political action deliberately aimed at achieving specific political outcomes, and we further differentiate that into primary, tertiary, or secondary, tertiary influence. So what are these forms of influence? So first of all, we conceptualize participation as a fluid set of repertoires of political action that span across face-to-face and digitally enabled activities. Something that was perhaps a bit more revolutionary a few years ago. Now, after a year and a half of lockdowns and us, relying on digital media for everything, should be less controversial. But crucially, again, the focus is these activities have to aim to exercise influence on politically relevant outcomes. What are these outcomes? We think there are three levels that we can differentiate between. There's primary influence that has to do directly with policy decisions, things like signing a petition, endorsing a referendum, trying to change policies directly. A secondary level of influence, which is the selection of public officials. So when you campaign, when you participate in a campaign or support a campaign, that will result in selecting elites. And tertiary, which is where a lot of the classic political science literature doesn't align with what we believe. We believe that trying to influence other people's political preferences and actions is a form of political action. When you try to convince somebody to vote and to vote in a certain way, you are participating in politics. And that is not what some of the classics argue, but that's what we argue in this book. So essentially, this is the basic model we test in the book. We test three different experiences, political experiences on social media: exposure to political content you agree with, accidental exposure to political information, and exposure to political mobilization, meaning messages that try to convince you to vote in a certain way. And we test whether there is a relationship between these experiences and forms of political participation. I could spend a half hour discussing the literature around these three experiences, but I trust that many of you are familiar with the key arguments why these three experiences might lead people to engage in higher levels of political activity. The second level of our analysis looks at differential effects, where these relationships are moderated by political attitudes. As I mentioned, political involvement, ideology, vote for populists. And the third level of our analysis, which is the comparative analysis, looks at whether systemic features of different countries moderate these relationships between political experiences on social media and participation. We rely on a comparative research design, which includes 9 Western democracies, fortunately not Canada, but we have a rather diverse set of countries, again, within the realm of Western democracies, where after the last general election between 2015 and 2018 in each country, we ran online surveys administered by Ipsos on panels constructed to resemble the population of internet users, of adult internet users. We have decent samples for each country, so a total sample size of more than 16,500. Importantly, we are running analysis on cross-sectional self-reports of observational data. So of course, the claims of causality that we can make are non-existent. However, we innovate compared to other research in this area that has used surveys by pre-processing our data based on coarse and exact matching, which is a statistical technique that basically allows you to make sure that when you compare, for example, people who did and did not encounter news on social media accidentally, you are comparing people that are as similar as possible among in terms of a set of other variables that should explain whether they encounter news accidentally on social media. And that's just one example. And so basically what this technique does is that it narrows down your sample. It throws out some respondents from your analysis that are very unlikely, that have not encountered social media, politics on social media accidentally in this example, and are very unlikely to ever do. That they have characteristics in terms of age, gender, education, and interest in politics, attention to the campaign, and political efficacy that suggest that they are very unlikely to ever encounter accidental exposure on social media in the first place. Happy to respond, answer questions in the Q&A about this. But what this technique does, it effectively raises the bar for significant associations between our variables of interest, and it gives us a little more confidence that because we're comparing apples and apples and not apples and oranges in terms of different respondents who have and have not experienced these experiences, that there is more, that our statistical results are more robust. Now, our dependent variable is an index of political participation that sums 6 activities which measure primary, secondary, and tertiary influence. And as you can see, it comprises variables that are, in some cases, measure behaviors that are very popular, like trying to convince someone to vote for a candidate, and other variables that are very rare, like financing a party. And the distribution of the index overall is, doesn't suggest that our sample is full of political junkies. Most people don't do any of these activities, and the modal category after that is just one activity, and it declines very steeply, as one would imagine in a population. Most people don't participate much in politics at all. In our regression analysis, we have as independent variables, we look at main effects regarding exposure to supportive, oppositional, two-sided, or non-political content on social media. I'll say what they are in a second. Accidental exposure to political news on social media, and exposure to political mobilization. We look at differential effects with interaction terms between these variables and interest in politics, attention to the campaign, ideology, and populist voting behavior. And then we have a large set of control variables that measure political attitudes, political preferences, exposure to different types of news outlets for politics, frequency of use of different social media, and basic demographics. So these models are quite robust. They predict decent portions of the variance. In this presentation, I'm only going to show you effect size plots and not regression coefficients. They're, of course, all in the book if you're interested. Now, in terms of our key independent variables, we measured exposure to agreeing and disagreeing content, which there's a lot of literature about this that postulates that social media are echo chambers. We only see what we already agree with. There's also a lot of literature on interpersonal conversation that shows that most people mostly talk to people they agree with, apart from the workplace. So what's the role of social media in promoting pluralism? Now, we measured this in a way that, as every way is not perfect, but we believe is robust. which is we ask people two questions: how often they agree with the political opinions and messages published on social media by the people they follow, and how often they disagree. And basically, we compared the answers to these two questions. So if you answered in the same way to both questions, then you end up in the two-sided category. So if somebody says often to both, then they are embedded in what we call a two-sided conversational environment, where they see similar proportions of messages they agree and disagree with. And as you can see from the chart, that's actually the modal category. Almost the majority of in our sample actually sees messages from both sides, or at least remembers and self-reports see messages from both sides. If you if you answer the first question with a higher response mode than the second, then you're in the one-sided supportive category. So you see messages you agree with more than disagree with. And as you can see, this is actually a very small percentage. Echo chambers, filter bubbles, well, not so much according to our data. This is actually the smallest subgroup. And if you see messages you disagree with more often than messages you agree with, then you're in the one-sided oppositional category. And that's quite a sizable group as well. Now, we can talk about self-reports all day long. We also measured these perceptions when it comes to interpersonal conversations in face-to-face settings and on the mass media. And we find that the real echo chambers are in face-to-face conversations. That's where people are more likely to be exposed to one-sided supportive environments, whereas in the mass media, as could be expected, people are even more likely than on social media to be exposed to messages that they disagree with or to messages that are balanced. So social media sort of like sit in between the echo chambers of face-to-face conversations and the public sphere of traditional media. Accidental exposure to political news, again, very difficult to measure with a survey. We asked a question that is quite standard in this literature, and we found that almost 45% of our respondents report that often or very often are exposed to political news on social media accidentally. So it seems like, again, the idea of a filter bubble, the idea that you can isolate yourself from politics and never see any politics at all on social media, that doesn't seem to be true, at least according to our respondents. And finally, political mobilization. Around 30% of our respondents recall receiving messages intended to convince them to vote for a party, leader, or candidate in the last election, which again is a pretty high number. And again, I don't want to make too much of these like point estimates based on an online sample, although a pretty robust one. But it does suggest that social media are quite a lively arena for electioneering, as we know from other research. So what are these direct effects? What are these main effects? And again, I use the word effect as a shorthand. I'm well aware that we didn't run a field experiment here. When it comes to supportive political content, as you can see here, the predicted levels of participation for people exposed to supportive political content are higher, and in many cases significantly so, than those in the other groups. So even though this group is a small one, it's only 13.8%, they're the ones that participate in politics the most. And so this confirms arguments by Diana Matz and others that it's great to hear the other side, but if you want an engaged citizenry, the people who are in the echo chamber are the ones that are most engaged. Secondly, in terms of accidental exposure to political news on social media, in our regression models, the coefficient for this variable is positive and significant, but it's much weaker than for the other two political experiences we look at. And so when you plot it as effect sizes, you can see that the confidence intervals between the different modes overlap. So it's not so strong that when we plot it on typical respondents in our sample, we see results that differ significantly, which confirms some recent skepticism in the literature about the real potential of accidental exposure to news on social media to make a difference. Finally, political mobilization is the variable that shows the strongest relationship with participation, with rather big differences, 1.2 if you were non-mobilized versus 1.8 if you were mobilized. Confidence intervals clearly don't overlap. But this is really just the hors d'oeuvre, the appetizer in our study, because we're really interested in these differential effects. So let's look at how different political attitudes moderate the relationships we've looked at. And we start from political involvement as a moderator. Our contention here, and it's a key theoretical contention, is that unlike in the Web 1.0 era, remember that when we went on search engines and websites and got information there, that was a pull era where people needed to get from the internet what they wanted. Social media is a push medium, is a medium where either the advertisers on social media or our friends and contacts push information to us, or the algorithm, right? They push information to us. So whereas in a pull medium, it makes perfect sense that only people who care about politics will get political information, and the rich will get richer, they will become even more engaged. In a push medium where occasionally, as we saw previously, political messages do reach people, even if they're not particularly engaged in politics. And this is something we show in chapter 3 of the book, but I couldn't squeeze that part in this presentation. But to the extent that political content through social media now reaches beyond the usual suspects, then what should happen is what we call a law of diminishing returns. If you're already a political junkie, sure, reading tweets from politicians or from other political agitators will mobilize you even more. But at the end of the day, there's only so much you're going to do. You already know a lot. You already know what you can do to make your voice heard. You probably already do it. So yeah, it's going to complement your repertoires, but it's not going to make a whole world of difference. By contrast, if you're somebody who is not particularly engaged in politics, but you're reached by political messages that agitate you, infuriate you, mobilize you, inform you, enlighten you, whatever happens, this is to some extent a black box. We don't really know what happens in those exchanges. We just measure recall of those exchanges happening. But what happens in those exchanges might make a bigger difference for you, because to some degree, your political brain is emptier than a political junkie's political brain. Your knowledge of opportunities to participate is lower. Your overall level of participation is lower, so you have more room to grow. And so we believe that as a result of these phenomena, we should see differential effects of political experiences on social media on political participation, but they should be stronger among the relatively less politically involved users compared to the more involved users. And so we test that by looking at interaction terms between our key independent variables and interest in politics, which is a long-term predictor of political involvement, and attention to the campaign, which is a short-term predictor of long-term involvement. And I'm only going to show you results for interest in politics. The ones for for attention to campaigns are essentially identical. So as you can see here, sure, the confidence intervals can become wider as you go from very interested to not at all interested, but the point estimates quite clearly suggest that for the very interested, supportive political content access through social media makes a tiny difference, very small difference, almost overlapping with zero. But if you're not at all interested in politics, it makes quite a huge difference. It basically doubles your levels of predicted participation. So it does seem to be the case that the less involved get a higher marginal utility. The same is true for accidental exposure to news on social media. Again, smaller effects, same as in the main effects model, large confidence intervals, but as you can see, there is some statistical evidence that there's something going on for people who are not interested in politics. There's not much going on for people who are already interested in politics. And political mobilization, it moves the needle among all groups, but again, more among the people who are not interested in politics than among the people who are interested in politics. So we do find some support of this idea of a leveling effect of political experiences on social media, in some cases completely annihilating the gap in terms of political participation between those who are very interested and those who are not interested in politics. Now, a question that we started getting from 2016 onwards, when the whole world changed and our understanding of social media became more complicated and more perhaps grown up, was, well, okay, but what about Trump? What about Brexit? Okay, you're showing us that social media are bringing new people to the table. Great, that's good for equality. But what if these people are barbarians? What if these are all people who will storm the Capitol, the US Capitol, or vote for Brexit, or vote for populist parties all around Europe? And again, we struggle with these questions because we try to, maintain the Weberian approach of, trying to conduct social science in a value neutral way. But at the same time, these are empirical questions that are interesting. If there is a populist tide across the world, which it showed likely, it seemed more likely maybe a year or two ago than it is now, but who knows? There's elections every year in a lot of countries. If there is a populist tide which has coincided with this expansion of the role of social media, and if social media bring new people to the table, on the one hand, they have expanded the range of views, arguably, that are mainstream in our public sphere. But does that mean that they have helped racists and people who want to destroy democratic norms get a chance to be heard that they wouldn't have had when they had to go through gatekeeping by news professionals. So yes, Fridays for Future, great, but also maybe alternative for Deutschland or other populist right-wing populist parties around the world. So we didn't measure populist attitudes in the surveys. This was not what our project was aimed to do, but we have two variables that we use to try and at least get us closer to an answer to this question. First, we have ideology. So if social media are helping more extreme factions become more powerful, mobilize activists, recruit people, mobilize resources, then we should see people who with more extreme ideologies being more affected by the political experiences we look at. And secondly, if social media are helping the populist digital tide, then we should see people who vote for populists be more affected by these political experiences on social media. Now, so we use basically ideology and self-reported voting behavior as our moderators. In terms of ideology, which are the only effect sizes I'm going to show you here, there's very little going on. In most cases, ideology doesn't make a difference. When it doesn't really show a differential effect where the most extremist voters benefit more from these political experiences in terms of their political participation. It's actually the moderates that seem to see their participation levels, as predicted, be higher than the more radical voters. There is a little bit of evidence that center-right voters see their participation increase a bit more based on through accidental exposure to political news, and to some degree based on levels of political mobilization, but that's the same as centrist voters. So we don't see these results as supporting the idea that more radical voters will become will be mobilized disproportionately by these political experiences on social media. In terms of populist voting behavior, I'm not going to show you any data here because we ran a lot of models. That's because it's very difficult to agree, to get scholars to agree on a classification of populist voting behavior. We didn't measure populist attitudes. That's also a subject where people don't agree these days. But in terms of classifying political parties, there are many classifications out there. We took all of those that we could find, we combined them, we integrated them with our own knowledge, we came up with different ways of classifying populist voting behavior. We basically found nothing. There is no difference in the relationship between these three political experiences on social media and participation when you differentiate between people who voted for populist parties versus non-populist, right-wing versus left-wing. Do you include the Conservative Party in the UK as a populist party, or you don't? You can think about any permutation and any classification of populist parties that you know about. I think we tried it and we found basically nothing. So we don't see any evidence that social media have helped populists ride a digital tide, at least not the kinds of experiences we look at. Of course, we didn't measure misinformation and disinformation. We didn't measure trolling. We didn't measure other kinds of behaviors that are arguably relevant. Finally, let's look at systemic features. And I have to say, this is the part of the book where we were trying to innovate the most compared to the existing research, because there's not a whole lot of research that is comparative in this area. So we had to build some theories from scratch and test it with, unfortunately, a small number of countries, because 9 countries is great, but it's not enough to run certain kinds of models. It doesn't give you enough degrees of freedom to test different variables simultaneously. So there are limits to what we can do. But basically, for each of the political experiences we look at, we identify one systemic features that we think could moderate their relationship with participation. So first, we reason that in majoritarian democracies, citizens' political loyalties tend to be weaker than in proportional democracies. Again, all else being equal, these are big generalizations. There's polarization in the US, maybe there's polarization in Britain as well. But in general, parties in majoritarian democracies are bigger churches than parties in proportional democracies, at least when it comes to the kinds of voters they court, and therefore they inspire different weaker loyalties, at least in general in the population. So we reason that encountering supportive political content on social media might be more strongly related with participation in these countries, because voters in these countries are less loyal to their parties, and so the boost that they get from talking to people they agree with might be stronger in terms of how it enhances their participation. Secondly, we reason that accidental exposure to political news could be moderated by the media system in which people live. And we use the Hollin and Mancini classification, where they differentiate between media systems where politics and the media are autonomous and systems where they're more integrated, broadly speaking. And we reason that in systems like the liberal media systems, like the US, the UK, Canada to a large degree, where media and politics are more autonomous from each other, journalism tends to be, all else being equal, more neutral. And again, I know there is polarization in the media system in the US. I know very well that there are vicious partisan tabloids in Britain, but most people still get their news from relatively objective and impartial news organizations in both countries. And so we reason that the kind of boost to participation that you would get from accidentally encountering political news on social media should be bigger in these countries, because we know from research on news and participation that it's partisan news that enhances participation. It's not middle of the road objective journalism that enhances participation. And we thought that the kind of news that people get on social media tends to be more partisan than the kind of news that they get in mainstream media. Finally, we reason that political mobilization on social media may have a stronger relationship with participation in systems that are party-centric, where parties historically play a stronger role. Because in these systems, parties are permanent infrastructure for participation, so they can channel citizens' appetite for participation more continuously, more robustly, more directly than in systems where parties come and go, where it's mostly candidates that set up shop before the election and then they leave. What do we find? Well, in terms of our ideas about supportive political content in majoritarian versus proportional electoral systems, we do find support for our theory. The relationship between exposure to supportive political content on social media and participation is slightly stronger in countries that we classified as majoritarian versus countries that are proportional. So we find support for our hypothesis. No support whatsoever in terms of accidental exposure in media systems. And again, maybe it's because the relationship was already so weak in the main effects that it's unlikely that it would vary that much. Or maybe it's because our theory is wrong. Maybe we should have adopted a different classification of media systems, but we didn't find what we expected to find. And finally, for party and candidate-centric systems, as you can see from the effect plots, the estimates, the confidence intervals of the estimates overlap, but in our regression model, the coefficient was significant. So overall, the relationship is significant. There is a significant difference between party-centric and candidate-centric systems in terms of the strength of the relationship between exposure to electoral mobilization and political participation, but it's not as strong. So a lot of limitations in this work. It's observational data, as I already mentioned. We try to account for some of these limitations through coarse and exact matching, but it's obviously an imperfect way of assessing these relationships. These also are cross-sectional surveys, not panel data, so we cannot disentangle which comes first. Recent research is looking at these issues in a much more nuanced way, looking at reciprocal effects. A lot of these studies show that there are reciprocal effects, so it's likely that in the relationships we're looking at, there also are reciprocal effects. So getting exposed to political experiences on social media makes you more engaged and makes you participate more, but the other way around is also true. Participating in politics will make you more likely to get exposed to politics on social media, whether because you select yourself into following politicians or because the algorithms think that you are more likely to like that content. We are using online surveys. It's very difficult these days to do random population samples. Ours is not one for sure. We're using self-reports. There's amazing work that uses computational methods to unobtrusively measure these variables. Ours doesn't do that. And as I mentioned earlier, it really would be beneficial to test our hypothesis in comparative perspective to have a larger and more diverse pool of countries, at least within the realm of Western democracies. We could probably argue that outside of democracies, we would need different theories to test, not only more countries, but at least within democracies, we would need more diversity and greater numbers to really test these patterns in a more robust ways. But what do we think we have contributed with this book? First, we believe that we have shown that social media are part of the solution more than the problem of declining participation and weakening political organizations across Western democracies. Maybe people don't care so much about participation these days anymore because we're worried about disinformation, polarization, incivility, and intolerance. And these are very, very valid concerns. But a lot of the literature, not too long ago, was very concerned, and a lot of politicians were very concerned about the decline of citizen participation, which has arguably been reversed in many countries. Think about turnout in the US, for example. And we believe that our data hint that social media might be part of the story there. Social media also may be closing participatory gaps rooted in different levels of political involvement. So, the idea that they are simply weapons of the strong is not necessarily vindicated by our data. Granted, we didn't look at class, we didn't look at ethnicity, we didn't look at gender, we didn't look at income or education. Maybe if we did, we would be less optimistic. But when you look at levels of interest in politics, which is a variable that we know from research by Marcus Pryor and others, it's not a variable that you can change very easily. You cannot get people more interested in politics during their lifetimes. They start with a level of interest in politics after their political socialization is over, and they basically stay there for most of the time. So if you cannot change that, but you can bridge the gap between those with low and high levels of interest, that's an important achievement in the context of democratic equality. We found little evidence that social media are making our politics more polarized, more radicalized, and more populist. Maybe we didn't have the best measures. Maybe we should have looked at disinformation and trolling rather than the kinds of experiences we're looking at. But we do not find any evidence that the experiences we're looking at are making a difference in favor of extremists or right-wing populists. Political institutions matter. We did find that some country characteristics moderate our relationships of interest, but less so than individual level variables. And we believe that this might be because the way in which social media function around the world, at least around the democratic world, is quite standardized. There's very little regulation of it. Regulation doesn't change across countries yet. And they function pretty much in the same way. Granted, they probably spend more time minimizing the harms that they do in countries like the US, where they have a big spotlight on them, than in a country like, I don't know, Montenegro. But the way they function is pretty much the same. And so that might explain why our findings are so similar across countries. We do acknowledge, and we try to be thoughtful about this in the conclusions of the book, that there is a normative ambiguity in interpreting our findings. And this is the thought I will leave you with. Obviously, our models look at whether there's more or less participation among people who do or do not experience certain kinds of political content on social media. Is more participation a democratic good in itself? Well, without going back to the arguments in the 1970s about the system being overloaded by hippies protesting against the Vietnam War, which was the argument that people like Samuel Huntington made in the 1970s, we believe you can say safely in 2021 that more participation is not always good. Storming the Capitol could be participation, but it's not a great idea. Sharing misinformation is not a great idea, but it is a form of participation that could, inviting somebody to vote for a candidate based on misinformation could have ended up in our data set as a positive answer to that question. And that is definitely not a good idea. But where we think we're on a more solid and less ambiguous normative footing is that demonstrating that there's greater equality in who participates, at least from an observational perspective, is a democratic good that we should consider. That's all from me. It was a great pleasure to present our work here, and very much look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristian. This 250-page book is very, very substantive. It covers a lot of ground. And I think that you were very successful to do a 30-minute or so presentation to summarize the main findings of your book. So thank you very much. I invite the audience now to ask their questions. And to do that, I will invite you to push the raising your hand button. So we may give you an opportunity to make comments or to ask a question. Kaula, if you would like to, Kaula has posted a comment in the chat. Maybe Kaula, would you like to ask the question or make your comments vocally?
Do you... Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Yeah, I just want to say that the results are very interesting since they confirm some result of the existing literature. The article Schumann assessed whether the use of social media as a source of information serves to maintain existing populist attitude or facilitated attitude change to a more extreme position. And the result indicate that the use of social media has helped to maintain a more stable level of populist attitude. So that's very interesting that the results are confirming the existence literature. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Kaula. André.
Thanks a lot. I have one question and one comment. The question is about whether you've looked at the differential impact on different forms of participation, whether the effects are all the same or not. And my comment is on the limits of your study. And if I were to mention the limit, I guess, or what that I think is most crucial, and perhaps you should go in the next study, would be panel data. Would you agree with me that's the most important limitation? Thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciate both of your comments. We did look at the differences between the different components of our index. So we ran logistic regressions with each of these variables. And you don't find, basically, they tend to confirm the overall findings when you look at the cumulative index. So the relationships are pretty much the same. What you find is that the effects tend to be relatively bigger on the less common activities. So for the activities that are more common, the effects exist, the correlations exist, but they're smaller. For the activities that are less common, the correlations exist, but they're bigger. Other than that, we didn't find like a systematic pattern whereby, for example, is our activities aiming at exercise primary influence more likely to be affected than secondary or tertiary? We didn't find anything like that. We also, to the extent that some of our dependent variable of the components of the dependent variable could be characterized as being, more demanding or less demanding, high threshold, low threshold. Again, we didn't find anything, or online versus offline activities. We didn't find any particular pattern. The main pattern was if something is less common, in the population, that political experience will increase the likelihood that that activity happens in relative terms. I completely agree with you on panel data, and I would expect that some of the findings we had would not be confirmed by panel data, because obviously then you're measuring within subject variation with cross-sectional results. To some degree, you don't know if what you're measuring is between subject variations or within subject variations. And we do, I'm doing some other work that is based on panel data, and hopefully that will allow us to at least add more nuance to that. I think it would be very interesting. What I would be more interested in to see is that whether these differential effects stand up when looked at through panel data. So thanks for your questions.
Thank you. Henry Milner.
I find this fascinating and very happy to see this kind of research, because it's about matters that really make a difference. On the other hand, I know very little about social media. What my first question, I guess, would be for you to tell me a bit more how you measure what you mean by social media, and exactly what the question is when you're saying asking people if they use social media. It's not a question I would know how to raise. But what interests me is much less significant part of the research, which deals with traditional media. And there, at least as far as the United States is concerned, I find your conclusions rather surprising. Or maybe I've just misunderstood, but you seem to suggest that which traditional media you use doesn't seem to matter. And there's a great deal of literature, both not necessarily academic literature, but discussion in the media about the importance of Fox News, right-wing radio, and so on, very much affecting people in the United States. And that you're getting very different sources of information if you use them. I know you don't go into the whole question of misinformation, but it does seem to me that that is a dimension if you're, at least as far as the traditional media are concerned. So that's my specific question. But I would like to know more about social media, how you use it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in terms of measurement, this is a very important issue. And, with surveys, you're always faced with a challenge where you could ask people. So social media is a combination of different platforms. When we conducted the study, we asked questions that said, it wasn't in the slides at the beginning, things like various political activities are carried out on social networks or social media platforms, such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. So we're basically relying on people to think about these platforms. Obviously, if I was doing the survey right now, I would include Instagram. We later started measuring use of messaging apps like WhatsApp or Snapchat or Facebook Messenger, which we covered in other studies, not in this book. With surveys, you always face the challenge that we don't know. When people tell us they encounter opinions that they agree with on social media, we did not ask them specifically whether it was Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, whatever, Reddit, whatever. These are different platforms that have different purposes, different affordances, and it is very important to be specific about the platforms. At the same time, there is only so much you can achieve by asking people to remember what they did when they're using maybe 4 or 5 different platforms. Did you see it on Facebook? Did you see it on Twitter? Did you see it on Instagram? You might elicit some perceptions of what they see, but our choice was to be generic in our measurement, relying on the fact that people would be able to develop a overall perception of what they do on social media. We control in our models for how frequently they use specific social media, which is, I think, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and what do we have? I'm looking at the slide right now, I believe. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So that is accounted for in our models, but we chose not to measure all of these specific activities for each social media because we thought this would lead to a lot of noise in the data. I personally sometimes can't remember if I saw something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. It just happens. In terms of your second question, I completely agree, and I probably didn't speak very clearly when I presented the results for media systems. We don't argue that the traditional media people use don't matter. What we looked at is whether different media systems, so the country you live in, you classify the country people live in based on this classification of media systems between models that are more liberal and models that are more polarized and models that are in between. So this is a country level classification, not a classification of the news sources that people use individually. And so what we saw is that people in the US and the UK, which are the liberal media systems, when they are exposed to political information accidentally on social media, their levels of participation don't change in different ways compared to people in other kinds of media systems. But those results don't tell us anything about whether watching Fox News versus ABC or public service media in Canada versus commercial broadcasting in Canada would have different effects on participation. I completely agree with you that traditional media are very, very important. Actually, there is a paper that I'm finalizing and hopefully resubmitting in the next few days, where we show that there is a very stark divide in terms of belief and likelihood to share misinformation among the British audience, among the British public, depending on whether people get their news from traditional professional news organizations or on social media. So if people get their news through the BBC or the Guardian or the Times, they're a lot less likely to believe in misinformation and a lot less likely to intend to share it. If they get most of their news through social media, sadly, they are more likely to believe misinformation and more likely to share it. So I completely agree. What we were looking at with that model was something different. It had more to do with the configuration of the media system as a whole, as opposed to the single sources that people might or might not use for news. Thank you.
Thank you. Mathieu.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. So I wanted to hear a bit more about how social media closed the participatory gap. So if I understood the argument correctly, you say you find that basically exposure to some kind of messages have a stronger effect on the less interested than the more interested. But what I'm wondering about is that the exposure to these kind of messages vary by level of participation. So if I can make it clearer. So basically, the more interested, or like the effect is smaller for the more interested, but they're exposed to more messages of these kinds. So in the end, like, does it really close the participatory gap, or it just levels up and it has the same effect on everyone in the end because of the different level of exposure to these kind of messages?
Thanks. That's a great question. So the first thing I have to say is that obviously we didn't run an experiment. So what we can look at is just comparisons between groups in the real world and not whether, you know, forced exposure to some content would have led to that outcome. In chapter 3 of the book, we look at what were independent variables in this presentation. We treat them as dependent variables. So we try to understand the factors, demographic, attitudes, use of other kinds of media that predict those experiences. And we find that in some cases, it is what you say is true, that, for example, in terms of exposure to political mobilization, it is predicted by variables like interest in politics, for example. So if you're interested in politics, you're more likely to be exposed to political mobilization. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't apply to all the variables. For example, accidental exposure is the one where there's a lot of groups that are less involved in politics report being accidentally exposed to news. Where we hope that our study takes a step forward is that because we use coarse and exact matching to pre-process our data, that procedure should have removed or massively reduced the statistical relevance of those kinds of people that would never encounter news on social media, and therefore, you know, would correspond to what you were arguing, that yeah, these things could matter, but they really don't, because they don't happen to people. Now, it could well be true that in the aggregate, if we look at the real world, most of the participation that takes place is still happening among people who are more interested in politics. That is definitely true, descriptively. But what we think we have found is that conditional on exposure to these experiences on social media, these people with lower levels of interest see their participation grow a lot higher. Now, we're not saying that political experiences on social media will universally reach those people. That is unrealistic because of the ways in which the algorithm works. But at the same time, what we have shown is that when these experiences reach these people, then these people respond, or at least they report levels of participation that are actually comparable to people with high levels of interest who are reached by these experiences. I think the other important point that your comment raised, or at least that I picked up from your point, is effects over time. And I think that is really important. Our measures are very crude, both in terms of participation, did you do it or not how many times you did it, and in terms of the experiences people had on social media. Like, one was a yes or no question, one was a 4-category ordinal variable, you know, never, too often, to very often, and one was a combination of 2 questions with 4 categories. So we don't have a lot of granularity in terms of, you know, how strong the dosage is of the medicine. And obviously, again, going back to the comment by Professor Blake, we don't have a repetition over time. We cannot assess reciprocal effects, and let alone we can assess cumulative effects. And I think those are really, really important questions that we need the right research designs to answer them. And our study was just a very, very preliminary first step in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if other people have questions, but I have one. And also, I would like to highlight one aspect of the book you have not discussed in the presentation, which I found interesting. So the title of the book is Outside the Bubble. And now we understand that one of your claims is that all this scientific and popular discourse about echo chambers, filter bubble is somewhat inflated. And in the introduction of the book, you wrote that these phenomena, I quote you, are at best exaggerated and at worst unfunded. So my question here is, there's literature about the process of radicalization of some people who participate in politics in some ways that maybe we would prefer they don't participate, like storming the Capitol or showing intolerance regarding some groups of citizens and things like that. And there's literature based mostly on case studies, interviews with some radicalized people, which show that these people, many of these people have a pattern of consumption on social media, which will be a factor of radicalization. So will you say that the kind of survey you have relied on, conducted in, let's say, the general population, is not appropriate to capture that phenomena, which is a reality for a very small number of people in the society, but a small number of people in the society who may have a huge impact in public life. And secondly, in the third chapter of the book, you compare our frequent exposure to disagreement or agreement occur on social media, compare with offline discussions with our family, friends, colleagues. And if you could say a few words about that, I think it would be interesting, because I think that the problem or the issue of echo chamber is maybe somewhere else than on social media.
Thanks, Frederick. These are both great questions. On the first one, I completely agree with you. We are looking at these phenomena with a telescope, but to understand radicalization of small but committed groups, you need a microscope. You need in-depth studies of specific populations. Now, as I say this, I'm almost smiling, because I think when I came to Laval, I was a lot of the research I was presenting was based on surveys of Twitter users who posted about politics. Our study of dual screening in the UK election was based on a sample of Twitter users, panel data, but a sample of Twitter users who commented on a televised debate between the leader of the UK Independence Party and the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party before the European election in 2014. It doesn't get more niche than that. Obviously, we were not studying a radicalizing population, but it's interesting that it's fascinating how, in the social sciences, there's always something you can do. There's always a method that allows you to set your lens of your camera in a way that captures something and misses out on something else. Part of the reason why we stopped doing these surveys of these very specific populations was that we wanted to say something more generalizable. But at the same time, the value of what you can get by studying specific but relevant populations is completely different. And I agree with you that if we want to argue that echo chambers exist among the people who stormed the Capitol, well, that's probably true. And by the way, in chapter 3 of the book, when we look at echo chamber, the supportive versus one-sided versus two-sided, supportive versus oppositional environments on social media, we do find that the more you're interested in politics, the more likely you are to talk to people you agree with on social media. So even there, we do show, we're not saying echo chambers don't exist, but we're saying echo chambers exist among people like us, people who care about politics, people who use Twitter a lot, people who spend a lot of time thinking and acting politically. And for a variety of reasons, these factors lead us to be more exposed to politics, not only on social media, but elsewhere. And obviously, hopefully none of us storms the Capitol, but the properties of being highly interested in politics are obviously also characteristics of those people. They're just interested, they just have beliefs that are, in these cases, anti-democratic. So I think you're absolutely right. For these kinds of groups, we need different kinds of methods. Incidentally, these are not people that are going to be in an online panel. They're not going to be interested in taking a survey for a $2 incentive. You need to find these people in other places, and they're not going to collaborate. It's also going to be difficult to get them to collaborate with a research-based university. So there's all sorts of issue around that, and I think you're absolutely right. In terms of the comparisons, yeah. So what inspired us in that part of the analysis was that it's like, in general, when you talk about social media are destroying democracy, well, compared to what? Like, what is the alternative universe? How would democracy look like in 2021 in an alternative universe where there's no social media? But there are all the other problems, inequality, immigration, climate crisis, the changes in the global economy, changes in international relations, and the overall, sort of like decline of the Western model of civilization. What kind of politics would we have with all those things, but without Facebook? And by the same token, echo chambers compared to what, right? Sure, some people on some social media will be exposed to information they agree with, but compared to what? Like, what is the role of social media compared to other channels through which people encounter political content? And thankfully, surveys have a lot of limitations, and sometimes I almost feel like I'm a dinosaur by still doing these studies based on surveys. But I know I'm in good company here, so we're among friends. But one advantage that they have over everything else is that they allow for a one-stop shop set of measures, right? With all the limits of these self-reports, at least you can compare different channels. If you conduct a fantastic digital trace study of social media, at best you have data for Twitter and maybe some Facebook data, and maybe some YouTube data. But you can't compare that in the same way with data from exposure to other kinds of channels, including professional news organizations online and offline, which are very important. So when we looked at these different measures, and we also looked at private messaging apps, we asked the same question about encountering agreeing and disagreeing viewpoints on private messaging apps. We found that social media are basically there is more diversity of news and of viewpoints in the mass media, which confirms studies by Diana Matz in the past. Then there is social media, quite lower. There is less diversity on social media than on TV and newspapers, but there is more diversity on social media than on private messaging apps, which makes sense because this is where we mostly talk to our friends, to people we hang out with, to people we go play football with or whatever. And then there is interpersonal communication when there is less diversity. There is much more congruence of opinion with the people we spoke to face, which again confirms research by Diana Matz, by Robert Huxfield and his collaborators, which have shown that people tend to talk to other people about politics that they mainly agree with. It's only in the workplace that they sometimes encounter disagreement, maybe not so much in universities, but in other workplaces, yes. And so I think this is an important aspect of the debate, right? Sure, there are some people for whom social media will be echo chambers, but A, they're not that many, at least if you believe our estimates, and B, compared to the rest of the sources they have, only the mass media will leave. If you assume that exposure to the other side is beneficial, only the mass media will leave people better off. And granted, a lot of people still get their news through the mass media, but all the other sources of information that we measured are less diverse than social media.
I think Henry has a follow-up question.
Yes, since no one else seemed to have raised their hand, I'd like to push it a bit further into my own interest. which I don't think you've gotten into. You relate to political interest, but not to knowledge. And my own work argues that to be interested in political participation, and we should also be interested in knowledgeable political participation. To get more people participating and yet less informed about the choices to be made, I don't think is particularly helpful for democracy. So I just wonder if you have any measures that get at the effect, that the knowledge dimension. Are people who use the social media in this case, are they politically informed? Are they misinformed? Are they uninformed? And what effect does it have? At least that's the kind of questions I would like to know about. Thank you.
Thanks, and it is definitely an important question. So we did measure some political knowledge questions. I have to say very honestly that when we looked at the results and we looked at how we constructed the questions, we were not very satisfied with how we had constructed the questions, especially in some countries. We had questions about, do you know who the Ministry of Finance is? Well, these were like true or false questions, basically. And when we looked at the results and the distribution of the data, we were just not happy with how they stacked up. It's difficult. At least for me, it was difficult. I probably should have, paid more attention to these aspects. When you design a questionnaire, it's always a lot of work. We should have paid more attention to how the different measures translated across countries. In the UK, knowing who is the Chancellor, which is the Ministry of the Economy, it's a very prominent figure. In other countries, it's a less prominent figure because of the way the government works. Like in the US, for example, the Secretary of the Treasury is a lot less important than the Chancellor of the Exchequer here in the UK. And also more generally, I think there was something in the data that didn't convince us that these questions had measured what we wanted to measure. We did try them in some other analysis, not for this book. We wrote a paper about dual screening based on data from this project, where we looked at whether there was any difference in terms of political knowledge as a dependent variable, and we didn't find anything substantive there. I think we don't have the right questions. We did, more broadly, this project was not misinformation and misperceptions was a very important topic even before 2016, and there was already very important work in this area, especially connected to participation, as you mentioned. But it wasn't our primary interest with this project, and as I'm sure many people here know, sometimes you go into a project with a set of ideas and interests, and you pursue those, and then once you've started collecting data and it's too late to change course, you realize that there were other things that were very important that you overlooked. So I think and we say that in the book at some point, we don't know whether the people who participated, possibly more as a result of possibly the experiences we looked at, did so on the basis of valid information or on the basis of misinformation or on the basis of biased motivated reasoning and biased assumption about politics. I agree, it's a very important topic. There is emerging research in this space. For example, there is a paper by Sebastian Valenzuela and his colleagues where they looked at the reciprocal relationship between getting news on social media, participating in politics, and sharing misinformation. And what they found was that, yes, getting news on social media, which is not the same variable as we measure, but is somehow related, it does lead people to participate more. They have panel data, so they can do a better job at disentangling things than we do. But it also correlates positively with sharing misinformation. So it is possible that the same people that are participating more, partly thanks to social media, might also be doing so by sharing misinformation, which is obviously, I completely agree, not something that we necessarily want. So I think this book tries to make a contribution to some debates. It cannot contribute to other perhaps more current and very relevant debates. And we hope, and there's some work that I've been doing in this area more recently, which hopefully will speak to that. But I agree completely with the idea that we can't measure, we can only look at participation without knowing whether it's informed.
I would just suggest for future research and that the use of that the political knowledge kind of questions you might ask are not the sort of standard, do you know the name of the chancellor, but basic political knowledge you need to form an opinion on current issues, climate change, and ones that that are being discussed and decided upon in politics. I realize you can't then necessarily ask the same questions in a comparative analysis, but I think if we're really going to try to dig deeper into the effect of social media, this is a crucial dimension. I would encourage you or anyone in this area to try to take it on.
Thanks. I agree. I appreciate it.
So thank you very much, Christian. The audience has downsized during the past 15 minutes. Apparently there were other activities at noon in our time zone, but many people wrote in the chat how happy they are about your presentation, which they found very interesting. We have a tradition at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship to give our speakers a personalized gift. This is a tradition that we continue despite the mediation of our activities by Zoom. So usually we will ask you to open a box in front of a captive audience in a classroom to find what the gift is. But I will ask our coordinator, Wim, to show and to tell you what the gift is. Wim.
And you have won a cup of the CSDC, hopefully, okay, with your poster on it. So if you can send me your address where I can send it, we will be happy to send it to you. And thank you for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So I had on my script a series of reminders for diverse activities and funding opportunities, but because we are a very small number of people, I'm going to skip these. So thank you very much, Christian, once again for your presentation, et merci à tous et à toutes pour votre présence à cette conférence. La prochaine aura lieu dans 3 semaines. Kat Smith fera une présentation sur l'impact relatif de la compétition électorale au niveau local et national pour expliquer la participation électorale des électeurs. Ce sera le vendredi 3 décembre. Vous trouverez plus d'informations dans notre infolettre hebdomadaire. Merci beaucoup.